According to something called the pratfall effect, we tend to like competent people a little bit more when they make the occasional mistake. It reminds us that they're human. That being said, some mistakes stretch the definition of human error. From the guys who thought it'd be a good decision to make Hitler a spy, to the other guy who built an ark and got stoned for it, history's full of people who should have slept on it. Quickly though, before we get going, do us a massive favor and hit those like and subscribe buttons. It keeps content like this coming and tells YouTube you've got excellent taste. And also, let us know what other history topics you'd like to see us do later. I'm Michael with List 25, and these are the 25 dumbest decisions in history. 25. Making Hitler a state spy. After World War I, Germany was in shambles. The Allies forced them to hand over their weapons, pull back their troops, and pay about $37 billion in reparations. Their morale was at rock bottom, and that's putting it mildly. In the middle of all that, a frustrated young soldier named Adolf Hitler landed a job as a low-level intelligence officer for the German army. His assignment was pretty straightforward: spy on a small group of suspected Marxists called the German Workers' Party. But once Hitler started attending meetings, he realized they weren't Marxists at all. They were ultra-nationalists pushing anti-Semitic propaganda. And instead of reporting back, he joined them. Within a year, he had taken over the group, renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, and started giving speeches to massive crowds. The Nazis managed to take over in 1933 and ended up changing the world forever. 24. The Concrete Fleet. During World War II, the world started running low on steel, so someone came up with the idea to build a fleet of ships from concrete. What could go wrong? Well, as you can imagine, the plan made sense on paper, but the ocean didn't agree. Those ships were heavy, slow, and about as graceful as a brick in a bathtub. Or a fridge in a swimming pool. You get the idea. Cracks started showing up the moment they hit the waves, and keeping them afloat became a full-time job. They ultimately did find some use for them as floating warehouses and breakwaters, and you can actually still see a few of them right off the coast of Virginia. The front fell off. It's not supposed to do that. 23. A fort on the wrong side of the border. Fort Montgomery in the United States has a pretty weird backstory. It was built in 1844 on a small island in Lake Champlain, New York, and was meant to guard the northern border from attack. However, another one came before it. The first one started shortly after the War of 1812, but the problem was that nobody double-checked the maps. They spent months hauling in limestone and building a massive fortress before anyone realized it wasn't even on American soil. They built it in Canada. The project was scrapped immediately, and locals later dismantled the fort for building materials. Years later, the border was officially redrawn, and Fort Montgomery was built right on the spot where Fort Blunder once stood. 22. Locking scientists in a giant terrarium. In 1991, 8 researchers locked themselves inside a giant glass dome in the Arizona desert. The place was called Biosphere 2, and it was meant to be a miniature version of Earth, a completely sealed ecosystem that could show how humans might one day live on another planet. It cost around $200 million to build, stretched over 3 acres, and had everything: a rainforest, an ocean, and farmland. But it didn't take long for things to fall apart. The crew ran out of oxygen and had to pump in air from outside. Crops failed, cockroaches took over, and one crew member even had to leave for medical treatment. The project was later re-examined for lessons in sustainability, but as experiments go, it's remembered more for what went wrong than what went right. 21. Bombing Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Hundreds of planes dropped bombs and torpedoes that destroyed or damaged 19 American ships and more than 300 aircraft. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. It looked like victory for Japan, but they made a few critical mistakes. First of all, instead of hitting the fuel tanks, repair docks, and submarines, they focused almost entirely on the battleships. Even worse, the U.S. aircraft carriers weren't there that morning. They were out at sea, and those ships ended up leading the counterattack. Japan ended up waking up the one country it couldn't afford to fight, and the United States declared war the next day. 20. Invading Russia. In 1812, Napoleon marched into Russia with over 600,000 soldiers, convinced that he was going to win in a few weeks. By the time he reached Moscow, his army had been wrecked by hunger, disease, and freezing temperatures. Russian forces torched their own cities, food ran out, and only about 100,000 men made it back. Then, 129 years later, Hitler thought, you know what sounds like a good idea? The same thing. In 1941, he sent more than 3 million troops into the Soviet Union. The Germans advanced fast, taking millions of Soviet prisoners. But when winter hit, everything fell apart. The mud stopped their tanks, supplies ran out, and the Nazi advance collapsed before reaching Moscow. By the end of the winter, the so-called unstoppable army wasn't even moving, just like Napoleon's. 19. Taking the shortcut. 90 settlers left Illinois in 1846, with brothers Jacob and George Donner leading the way toward California. They were chasing a new life out west, long before the gold rush even started. For the first stretch, everything went according to plan. Then, someone suggested a shortcut. Instead of sticking to the established California Trail, they took a new route that promised to save them time, but cut straight through uncharted mountains. And I believe we all know how that one ended. 18. Attacking an hour too soon. Have you ever heard of the Bay of Pigs invasion? It was a massive flop and happened in 1961 when the US backed a group of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. Everything that could go wrong did. The invasion force landed in the wrong place. The locals didn't rise up to help, and worst of all, the promised American air support never showed up on time because the CIA and military planners forgot about the 1-hour time difference between Cuba and their airbase in Nicaragua. The bombers took off too early, missed their targets, and never linked up with their Navy escorts. Castro's troops crushed the invasion in 3 days. 17. Refusing to let people onto your ark. Johannes Stoffler was a well-known German astronomer and mathematician from the 1500s. He taught at universities, wrote books about the stars, and even has a crater on the moon named after him. So, when he predicted the end of the world, people listened. Stoffler told everyone that a giant flood would destroy everything on February 20th, 1524. And one nobleman, Count von Ingelheim, went as far as building himself a huge ark on the Rhine. When the day came, it rained just enough to make everyone nervous. Crowds rushed the ark, fights broke out, and more than 100 people were killed, including the Count, who was stoned to death after he refused to let anyone in. 16. Trusting a handwritten formula. Mariner 1 was NASA's big shot at reaching Venus, but it didn't even make it to orbit. A few minutes after its launch in 1962, the rocket went off course and had to be destroyed, all because someone left out a single hyphen in the guidance code. The computer read normal flight data as an error and tried to correct it until the rocket spun out of control. That one missing mark cost NASA about $18 million, which is roughly $170 million today. After the failure, NASA established stricter software review and verification processes to prevent similar errors from ever happening again. 15. Killing the world's oldest tree. Donald Curry was researching how ancient trees could reveal climate patterns in the 60s when he found a bristlecone pine on Wheeler Peak in Nevada. The tree, nicknamed Prometheus, was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Curry tried to take a core sample, but kept snapping his tools. So, out of time and patience, he asked the U.S. Forest Service for permission to cut it down so he could study it properly. They said yes. Back at his motel, he started counting the rings, and by the time he finished, he realized what he'd done. The tree was over 4,800 years old. The backlash was immediate. The Forest Service begged scientists to find an older tree, but they never did. Prometheus still holds the record as the oldest tree we've ever killed. 14. No wing struts for the Christmas bullet. Dr. William Christmas had big dreams and very little understanding of aerodynamics. which sadly didn't stop him from designing what he claimed would be the most advanced fighter plane in the world, the Christmas Bullet. The Christmas Bullet's wings didn't need support struts because Dr. Christmas believed they would perform better if they could move freely, almost like a bird's wings. Yeah, that theory didn't exactly hold up. On its first test flight, both wings tore clean off the plane, killing the pilot instantly. So, Dr. Christmas built another one, and used the exact same design. It crashed the same way and killed another pilot. And yet, he somehow kept getting government funding, mostly thanks to his charm and connections, which says a lot about the times. 13. Blaming everything on too much blood. For hundreds of years. Galen was one of the most respected doctors in ancient Rome, second only to Hippocrates. The man worked for emperors, wrote hundreds of medical papers, and pretty much set the standard for how medicine would be practiced. But, and yes, there is a big but, he wasn't allowed to dissect humans, so he studied pigs and monkeys instead. From that, he decided that most of our illnesses came from having too much blood. For the next 1700 years, bloodletting became the cure for everything from fevers to headaches. For some reason, nobody stopped to ask why so many patients were getting worse instead of better. 12. Protecting film instead of people. In 1945, Kodak started getting complaints from customers saying their X-ray film was coming out with strange dark spots. Julian Webb, one of the company's physicists, figured that the film had been exposed to radium from recycled packaging. But when he checked it, the source wasn't from the packaging at all. It was radioactive fallout. The straw board Kodak used to separate film sheets contained radioactive particles from the first atomic bomb test in New Mexico. Kodak had accidentally discovered nuclear fallout before the public even knew about atomic bombs. When they threatened to sue, the government didn't deny it. Instead, they made a deal. Kodak would get advanced warnings before every nuclear test as long as they kept quiet about it, which they did. 11. Shooting the messenger. Before George Washington was president, he was a Virginia militia officer sent to secure the British claim to the Ohio Valley. And because it was 1754, securing a claim meant building forts wherever you could hammer a stake. The French had the same idea. They sent an officer named Joseph Goulon de Jumonville on a diplomatic mission to do exactly the same thing. And when Washington's native allies stumbled across Jumonville's camp, Washington decided to ambush it. Now, at this point in time, Britain and France weren't actually at war yet. Washington captured Jumonville, and during the chaos, his allies killed the French officer. The mistake ignited the 7 Years' War and led directly to Washington's first big defeat at Fort Necessity. 10. Attacking a village that didn't exist. In March 1867, a group of American sailors shipwrecked off the coast of Taiwan. The local Paiwan tribe found them and, following their own customs, promptly killed them. It wasn't anything personal. The Paiwan did that to pretty much anyone who landed on their coast. But a few months later, the US decided the incident couldn't go unpunished. So, 181 sailors and Marines landed on Taiwan, ready to teach the locals a lesson. It went wrong the moment they stepped off the beach. For starters, nobody could actually find the villages they were supposed to attack. They spent a whole day wandering through the jungle while the Paiwan fighters ambushed them from the trees. By nightfall, one American was dead, and the rest fired a few shots into the forest before they retreated back to their ships. 9. Accepting the Trojan horse. We'll probably never know if the Trojan horse was actually real, but we do know that Troy existed. Archaeologists have discovered its ruins in modern-day Turkey near the ancient city of Hisarlik, so we know that at least part of the legend came from a real place. Now, according to the story, the Trojan War had dragged on for 10 long years when the Greeks finally gave up on brute force and tried something creative. Under Odysseus' orders, they built a massive wooden horse, hollowed it out, and hid soldiers inside. Then, they pretended to sail home. Thinking the war was over, the Trojans pulled the gift through their gates to celebrate. That night, the hidden Greeks climbed out, opened the city gates, and the rest of the army stormed in. Troy was defeated before sunrise the next morning. 8. Sending over 10,000 troops after one bandit. For anyone outside the US, Pancho Villa was sort of like Mexico's Robin Hood, depending on who you ask, of course. In 1916, he and his men crossed into New Mexico and attacked a border town, which did not go over well in Washington. So, General John Pershing packed up a couple of thousands of soldiers and marched into Mexico to bring him back. They spent close to a year chasing Villa through mountains and deserts, but never captured him. When Pershing finally returned home empty-handed, he called the whole thing a learning experience, and people actually went along with it. Villa eventually made peace with Mexico's government and retired to a ranch, but he was assassinated in 1923 while driving through Parral, Chihuahua. 7. Invading Gallipoli. Winston Churchill was never one to turn down a drink, so it's very likely that a few of those might have been involved when he came up with the Gallipoli plan. By early 1915, the trenches weren't moving, and Russia was losing badly. So Churchill, head of the British Admiralty, thought it would be a good idea to attack the Ottoman Empire through the Dardanelles, open a supply route to Russia, and hit Germany from the side. The problem was that the Turks already knew it was coming. They dug in, armed the high ground, and waited. When the Allied troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, mostly Australians and New Zealanders, they were trapped on open beaches with nowhere to go. Naval support pulled out after submarines sank a few battleships, and disease tore through the camps. After months of misery, the Allies gave up and withdrew. Tens of thousands of men lost their lives, and Churchill lost his job. 6. Prohibition. If an American told you they were going to see a man about a dog in the 20s, they weren't talking about getting a pet. It was code for finding a drink, usually whiskey. From 1920 to 1933, the 18th Amendment made it illegal to make, sell, or transport alcohol, but strangely enough, not to drink it. Prohibition, the so-called noble experiment, was meant to reduce crime and improve public health, but it did the opposite. Bootleggers got rich, gangsters became celebrities, and black market booze was often so toxic it killed about 1,000 Americans every year. When it was finally repealed, the country had learned an expensive lesson about legislating morality. 5. Trading farms for factories. The late 50s saw Chairman Mao turn China into one giant workshop. Farmers were told to stop farming and start making steel. Pots, tools, and even doorknobs were melted down in backyard furnaces that were supposed to fuel China's next industrial revolution. The furnaces spat out worthless lumps of slag, and while everyone was busy feeding the flames, the crops were left to rot. Local officials were too scared to tell the truth, so they faked harvest numbers, and the government kept taking grain that didn't exist. Then came the next big idea. Merge all the small farms into giant collectives run by party loyalists. By the time the Great Leap Forward ended in 1962, approximately 30 million Chinese citizens had died. 4. Declaring war on America. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the US went to war in the Pacific. Hitler didn't have to get involved. In fact, his pact with Japan didn't even require it. But he couldn't help himself. Germany was already fighting Britain and the Soviet Union, both wars going badly, so when Hitler stepped up to that microphone on December 11th, his generals called it madness, and rightly so. Overnight, he gave his enemies the world's richest industrial power as an ally. American factories began flooding Europe with weapons, planes, and tanks faster than Germany could destroy them, and by 1945, Berlin was in ruins. 3. Not bothering to claim Australia. You might not know this, but the Dutch were the first Europeans to reach Australia. In 1606, Captain Willem Janszoon sailed the Duifken along the coast of Cape York Peninsula, and over the next few decades, Dutch ships explored much of the western and southern coasts, calling the place New Holland. They made maps, logged observations, and for reasons no one's quite sure of, never claimed it. More than a century later, when Captain James Cook arrived in 1770 and planted the British flag, the land was still technically unclaimed, so it was theirs for the taking. 2. Trusting a fake spy. Juan Pujol Garcia was just a regular guy. a Spaniard who despised fascists and wanted in on the war. But the British turned him away. So he offered himself to the Germans, pretended to build a spy network in Britain, and fed them reports made up from newspapers and guesswork. The Germans were so impressed that they begged for more. When the Allies began planning D-Day, British intelligence turned Pujol into their secret weapon. Through him, they convinced the Nazis that the real invasion would hit Calais, not Normandy. The Germans took the bait and left their tanks where they were. By the time they realized the truth, the Allies were already across France. 1. Drinking poison to live forever. Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, spent his life uniting the warring kingdoms, building the Great Wall, and trying to make sure he'd never die. Toward the end, he became so obsessed with finding an elixir for immortal life that he started taking pills made by court alchemists who claimed they'd help him live forever. The main ingredient was mercury. He took them daily, convinced that he was buying himself more time, but instead, he slowly poisoned himself. The emperor grew paranoid and unstable, ordered scholars buried alive, and even turned against his own son. In 210 BCE, while traveling through China, he collapsed and died in his carriage at only 49 years old. He spent a lifetime chasing immortality and ended up proving just how mortal he really was. And that's all I have for you today. But now it's your turn. I want to hear from you. Which of today's entries told you something you never heard before? As always, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. You guys really, truly make this channel what it is. And if you haven't quite had your fill just yet, I've got you covered. Our related video, 25 dark and controversial books throughout history, it is full about books that got banned, burned, or blamed for ruining society. Basically, all of the good ones. Check it out, the link right here. Until next time, Mike out. Oh no, I tried it, didn't like it. I'll see you next time.